It was an unseasonably fine Saturday for Flaxborough's summer fete, that annual exercise in parochial optimism where the town's better sort arranged tables of sponge cakes and raffles, and the worse sort bought tickets for both. Mayor Cringlethorpe, red-faced and sweating faintly under his chain of office, had been smiling for nearly 2 hours. His endurance, admirable though it was, came not from civic duty, but from the knowledge that the Flaxborough Chronicle photographer was somewhere nearby and had already promised to send him a print as suitable for framing. On the green, the brass band concluded a nervous rendition of Jerusalem, and the Reverend Gloss announced that the official photograph of this year's fete would be taken in front of the floral arch. It was an event of mild consequence, an annual tableau of faces destined to fade under glass in the town hall corridor, reminding future generations of people they would not remember. The photographer, Mr. Jellicoe, thin and bespectacled, called out polite instructions. Closer together, please. Yes, Mrs. Gloss, splendid hat. Perhaps a touch to the right. Excellent. Young lady, if you'd step just beside the mayoress. Splendid, hold it there. The young lady in question, slim, fair, wearing a pale green frock of the inexpensive but hopeful sort, smiled obediently. Someone remarked that she was one of the new lodgers at Mrs. Spink's. Someone else said she seemed nice enough. Neither comment lingered long enough to register as memory. The shutter clicked. The crowd dispersed. By Monday morning, the photograph was printed in the Chronicle. And by Monday afternoon, the photograph had become a puzzle. Strange business, muttered Sergeant Malley, setting the newspaper before Inspector Pirbright's desk. The girl's gone, sir. Clean gone. Pirbright, who had been contemplating the neat geometry of a paperclip, looked up mildly. Gone? Out of the picture, said Malley, tapping the print with a thick finger. Here, Mayoress, Mrs. Gloss, the flower arrangement, and then nothing, just a gap. Pirbright leaned forward, adjusting his spectacles. Perhaps she moved, he suggested softly. Malley shook his head. No, sir. She was right there. Several people remember, the photographer remembers, but the print shows, well, empty air. Pirbright regarded the image a little longer. And the young lady's name? Iris Drabble, lodger at Mrs. Spink's, came here in May, worked at Trolley's drapery. Not seen since Saturday evening. The inspector's expression did not change. Then it seems, Malley, he said, that the camera was not alone in losing sight of her. By late afternoon, the story had reached its natural habitat, the tea tables of Flaxborough. At Mrs. Gloss's it was being discussed between slices of seed cake. Atrocious, isn't it? Murmured Mrs. Gloss. A girl, simply, evaporating. I said to the vicar only this morning, there's something rather continental about it. At the hairdresser's, Miss Pokeley opined that the photograph had been tampered with, which in Flaxborough meant as something improper. At the newsagent's, Mr. Meek confided that he'd always thought the girl looked the sort to make trouble, though he had never spoken to her. And in the police station, Pirbright quietly requested that Sergeant Malley have a word with the Chronicle's darkroom technician. He phrased it so mildly that Malley did not notice it was an instruction rather than a suggestion. That evening, Pirbright took a short walk past the fete grounds, now empty but for a few trampled paper cups and the ghostly smell of toffee apples. The floral arch still stood, though the flowers were wilting. He paused, gazing at it as if it might tell him something. A faint breeze turned one of the faded ribbons, pink, with the faintly mocking words, "Are brighter tomorrow." Pirbright smiled faintly. But," he murmured, though not for Miss Drabble, it seems. And he walked home, humming a fragment of the brass band's Uncertain Jerusalem, a tune that in Flaxborough seemed always just a little out of key. Flaxborough had an unrivaled capacity for converting tragedy into table talk, provided that the tragedy was not too close to home. By Monday evening, Iris Drabble's disappearance had joined the ranks of those local mysteries that were best enjoyed with sponge cake and mild outrage. The Women's Guild, meeting that night in the church hall, had intended to discuss the proposal for a new notice board. Instead, they found themselves conducting a brisk inquiry of their own. Mrs. Gloss, seated at the head of the trestle table and wearing an expression of benevolent concern, declared, "Of course, one hopes the poor girl's simply gone off for a rest. These shop girls, they work such long hours, and one hears about, well, breakdowns." Miss Pokeley, the hairdresser, who prided herself on both modernity and peroxide, leaned forward eagerly. "If you ask me, She's run off with someone. That's what they do these days. All this freedom. She was always in a rush when she came in for shampoo. Said she had somewhere to be. Mrs. Gloss gave her a pitying look. That may be so, dear, but vanishing from a photograph is hardly the usual way of announcing an engagement. A ripple of genteel laughter went round the table. At the far end, Mrs. Spink, Iris's landlady, dabbed her eyes with a handkerchief. She had been persuaded to attend, though her grief had already been expressed rather thoroughly to the Chronicle earlier that day. Such a sweet girl, she sniffed. Always polite, paid on time, kept herself to herself. Well, mostly. Though now I think of it, she did have callers. Callers? Repeated Mrs. Gloss, her eyebrows arching like semaphore arms. Mrs. Spink looked suddenly regretful. Just a gentleman once or twice. Never came in, mind. Waited by the lamppost. Miss Pokely sat back with the air of one whose theory had just been confirmed by Providence. Mrs. Gloss made a small noise, part sympathy, part intellectual interest. And did you, forgive me, Mrs. Spink, did you ever catch his name? No, dear, said Mrs. Spink, but I think he worked at the borough offices. He had that sort of pen. This description, though vague, was considered adequate by everyone except Inspector Pubright, who was not present but would soon hear it in triplicate. By Tuesday morning, the Chronicle's front page bore the headline, "Fat Girl Missing. Photo Mystery Baffles Locals." The accompanying article quoted the photographer, Mr. Jellicoe, who was described as completely mystified by the disappearance. He was also, as Pubright discovered that same morning, completely terrified of the police. Jellicoe's studio was a small, tidy establishment squeezed between a tobacconist and a shop selling artificial flowers. The air inside smelled faintly of developer and panic. "I can't explain it, Inspector," he said, running a nervous hand through his thinning hair. "She was there, plain as day, in the front row. I'd swear it before any magistrate." Pubright nodded mildly. "And yet she is not here now. Tell me, who handled the negative after you?" "Well, I took it to the darkroom, naturally, but anyone could have come in. The door's rarely locked. Mr. Meek from the paper sometimes borrows trays for his adverts." "Oh, a Miss Lanchester did pop in, but only to collect the church concert prints." "A Miss Lanchester?" "The lady from the Music Society. Red hair, brisk manner. You'll have seen her about." Pubright had. Miss Doreen Lanchester was the kind of woman who could make a parish committee feel like a parliamentary inquiry. He thanked Jellicoe gently, pocketing his notebook. "You've been most helpful, Mr. Jellicoe. Try not to lose any more of your subject. Flaxborough's population is small enough as it is." By the time Pubright reached the police station, Sergeant Malley had already heard 3 different versions of Mrs. Spink's story. Each version was slightly improved. "And now she says the man by the lamppost wore a trilby and had a look of experience," Malley reported. "I'm not sure what that means, sir." "It means, Sergeant," said Pubright dryly, "that she's seen one too many detective programs." He glanced again at the photograph, now pinned to the notice board beside a list of lost umbrellas. The gap in the front row was curiously precise. Not a blur or a smudge, but a small, empty absence, as though the universe had quietly edited itself. Pubright found it aesthetically interesting, if not yet criminal. That afternoon he accepted an invitation to tea at the vicarage, knowing full well that no such invitation was ever purely social. Mrs. Gloss, in her role as moral meteorologist, was eager to discuss developments. "The poor girl's mother came to see me once," she confided, pouring tea with careful grace. "Said her daughter had a tendency to, dramatics. Ran away from home, came back, that sort of thing. But she never mentioned a father, which I always thought curious." Pubright stirred his tea quietly. "Curious indeed." The vicar, a mild man who spent much of his time nodding at conversations he hadn't initiated, ventured a remark about the theological symbolism of disappearance, which Mrs. Gloss ignored. "Do you suppose," she asked, lowering her voice, "that someone might have wanted her gone?" Pubright considered this, watching the milk swirl into the amber tea. "Oh, I think that's possible," he said. Though in Flaxborough, Mrs. Gloss, people more often want others gone from sight rather than gone altogether. Mrs. Gloss gave a small laugh, uncertain whether she had been complimented or warned. As he walked back through the town, Pubright noticed how quickly the disappearance had settled into Flaxborough's rhythm. There were no search parties, no posters, no panic, only murmured theories and a faint increase in custom at the hairdressers. He paused before a shop window displaying the Fete photographs for sale. There, among smiling faces and bunting, the gap yawned quietly, a small omission that seemed to draw the eye. Someone had tidied the picture of Flaxborough and done it rather well. That evening, in his office, Pubright sat alone for some time, looking out at the faint light from the lamppost by the police station gate. He thought of the girl who had stood beside the mayoress, smiling politely for the camera, and then, for reasons yet to be known, ceased to exist in both photograph and town. He turned off the desk lamp, murmuring to himself, "There are ways of vanishing, Sergeant, that require no movement at all." And with that quiet thought, he went home. Number 7, St. Olave's Lane, had the look of a house that apologized for existing. Its curtains were always slightly drawn, its brass barely polished, and its front steps forever awaiting a paintbrush that never arrived. Mrs. Spink, who presided over it with fluttering pride, liked to call it a respectable address for respectable young ladies. Inspector Pubright stood at the gate for a moment before entering, noting the lace curtains twitching in slow, guilty rhythm. Puzzle. Inside, he found a hallway that smelled faintly of carbolic and boiled cabbage, a scent he privately considered the town's unofficial emblem. Mrs. Spink greeted him in her floral apron, already nervous. "Oh, Inspector, I'm so relieved you've come." "I've hardly slept. What with all the goings-on and that dreadful photograph, poor Iris. Such a sweet child, always so tidy," said Pubright gently, removing his hat. "Might I sit down?" "Of course, sir. Please, I've kept her room just as she left it, nearly." "I thought you might want to see." He followed her up a narrow staircase that creaked as though offering testimony of its own. The room was small, neat, and very nearly impersonal. A narrow bed, a small wardrobe, a table with a round mirror. On the dressing table sat a hairbrush, a cheap powder tin, and a postcard of Scarborough, unsigned, unaddressed. Pubright took in the scene quietly. Nothing was missing. Nothing was emphatically present. "Did she mention leaving, Mrs. Spink?" "Not a word, sir." "She went out Saturday evening, said she was meeting a friend at the fete. Wore her green frock. Looked very nice, I thought. Then she didn't come back. That's all I know." Pubright nodded. "And you didn't hear anything unusual that evening? Footsteps, visitors, perhaps?" Mrs. Spink hesitated. "Only Mr. Lanchester dropping off a box of leaflets for the Music Society. About 8:30. Mr. Lanchester?" "Yes. Doreen's brother. He's on the council, you know. Very respectable. Brought the leaflets in, left them on the sideboard. Didn't stay long. Did he speak to Miss Drabble?" "Oh, I don't believe so," she said quickly. "She was out by then. At least, I think she was. I went up early, you see." "My feet." Purbright's eyes wandered to the small wardrobe. "Would you mind?" "Oh, do look, Inspector. I've not touched a thing." Inside hung 3 dresses, 1 coat, and an empty space where another hanger had once been. Pubright noted it but said nothing. Instead, he examined the dressing table more closely. A faint ring of dust showed where a photograph frame had stood. Did Miss Drabble keep any photographs? Mrs. Spink's face froze for half a second. "Why, yes, a little one. Of her mother, I think. I sent it to the Chronicle man when he came round yesterday. Thought it might help them print something." "How thoughtful," said Pubright. "Did the Chronicle man have a name?" "Oh, yes, Mr. Meek. He said he was doing his bit to help." Pubright smiled faintly. "Indeed, Mr. Meek is a very civic-minded man. Back at the police station, Sergeant Malley had arranged the available evidence with military optimism. 1 missing girl, 1 missing photograph, several surplus theories. This is..." "Spink says she's certain the girl went to the fete," Malley reported, "and that she was seen with a tall man in a grey suit. But then Miss Pokely says it was brown, and Mrs. Gloss insists she saw the girl talking to the vicar's verger, though the verger swears he was helping with a tombola." Pubright smiled slightly. "In Flaxborough, Sergeant, one must never underestimate the mobility of a vergier." Malley, uncertain whether this was humour, chose to look solemn. Purbright's tone grew thoughtful. "The Lanchesters," he said. "What do we know of them? A brother and sister?" "Doreen Lanchester runs half the committees in town. Brother, Lionel, sits on the Council Finance Subcommittee. Bit of a pompous article, if you ask me." "I didn't," said Pubright mildly. "Oh, but I agree," he stood, moving to the notice board where the Fayette photograph still hung. The empty gap seemed to him to have grown, though of course it hadn't. The imagination, he thought, was a poor instrument for measurement. "Sergeant, do pop down to the Chronicle this afternoon. Have a chat with Mr. Meek about that photograph Mrs. Spink lent him. Find out whether it arrived, intact." Malley nodded, scribbling obediently, and if he asks why, Pubright gave him a look of mild amusement. "Tell him we're compiling an album. He'll like that." That evening, Pubright made a brief social visit to the Lanchester home, a narrow Victorian villa with a severe air of moral superiority that comes from being dusted daily. Miss Doreen Lanchester received him in a crisp white blouse and the kind of smile that came from a lifetime of dealing efficiently with inferiors. "Inspector, how very kind of you to call. I do hope you're not taking this silly photograph business too seriously. Poor Mr. Gellico must be beside himself." Purbright's manner remained bland. "I'm merely trying to establish who was at the Fayette, Miss Lanchester." "Oh, everyone was there," she said, except those who weren't, of course. "I didn't notice this girl myself. Iris something, was it? But one can't be expected to remember every drapery assistant." "Quite so. Your brother attended, I believe." "Lionel?" "Yes, briefly. He doesn't enjoy Fayettes. Says they remind him of electioneering." "Very understandable," said Pubright, glancing around the immaculate drawing room. On a sideboard, framed photographs stood in precise alignment. One of Doreen at the Music Society, another of Lionel receiving some small civic award, and one space where a photograph appeared recently removed, a faint outline of dust, identical to the one he'd seen in Iris's room. An admirable house," said Pubright. "Very orderly." Doreen's eyes flicked towards the space and back again. "One must be, Inspector. Disorder is a kind of decay." Pubright inclined his head. "And decay, Miss Lanchester, is the one thing Flaxborough will not forgive." She smiled thinly. "Quite." When he left, the evening light was fading, and the lampposts along St. Olave's Lane were beginning to glow. Pubright paused at the corner, glancing once more at number 7. Through the upper window, Mrs. Spink was visible, dusting the girl's empty room with the tender care of one polishing her own importance. Pubright smiled faintly, turned up his collar, and walked on, thinking, as he often did, that Flaxborough was less a town than a series of well-kept secrets pretending to be neighbours. The Tuesday afternoon meeting of the Borough Council was, as usual, more performance than progress. Councillor Harby, who chaired the session with the self-importance of a man presiding over the empire, began by announcing that the Fayette's accounts had balanced to within a tolerable margin, which in Flaxborough meant undisclosed discrepancies neatly ignored. By the time the question of the missing girl arose, most of the council were fanning themselves with their agenda papers and considering tea. "And now, as to this unfortunate matter," said Harby, his tone one of indulgent benevolence, "I see no cause for alarm." The young woman clearly chose to absent herself. Perfectly ordinary. Shop girls are restless creatures. There was a murmur of agreement. Mrs. Harbottle, who represented the library committee, added, "Indeed, my niece ran away once, to Skegness, returned within 3 days, thoroughly chastened." Councillor Lionel Lanchester adjusted his tie and said firmly, "I quite agree. There's no question of foul play. We mustn't encourage gossip. The Chronicle is already making a circus of it." From the back of the room, a quiet voice spoke. "Gossip, Councillor," said Inspector Pubright, "tends to arise where curiosity has been left unattended." A faint smile flickered around several faces. Harby cleared his throat. "Ah, yes. Thank you, Inspector. Your department is of course handling the inquiry?" "Such as it is, said Pubright pleasantly. "We have little to go on save a vanished photograph and some discrepancies of recollection." "Well," said Harby briskly, "best to draw a line under it. We've all had enough excitement. After all, there's no proof she didn't simply leave town." Pubright nodded. "Indeed not. Though proof of absence is a rather delicate commodity." When the meeting broke up, Pubright lingered a moment in the corridor, where framed photographs of past Fayettes lined the walls, smiling groups of the forever unimportant. Each year's picture had the same composition, bunting, civic pride and faces half aware of their mortality. But this year's print had not yet been hung. It lay on a table, awaiting its frame. Pubright leaned closer. The space where Iris Drabble had stood was not merely empty. It was subtly cleaner than rest, a patch of photographic air slightly too even, too neat. He could almost sense the brush of a retoucher's tool. Mr. Jellicoe, he thought, was either more careless or more frightened than he had let on. Outside in the narrow streets behind the town hall, the afternoon heat carried the smell of bread from the bakery and the sharper tang of printer's ink from the Chronicle office. Pubright found Mr. Meek in his usual position, half buried behind a counter strewn with stationery and self-importance. "Dupree, oh, Inspector," said Meek, all fluster and grin. "If you've come about that photograph, I can explain everything." "Please do," said Pubright. "Well, it's the strangest thing. Mr. Jellicoe brought in the negative himself, said it needed a touch of contrast before printing. I ran it through as usual, but when it developed, no girl, I assumed some sort of exposure fault. Happens often enough, you know." Pubright looked at him mildly. "Does it? That sort of fault?" "Well, not precisely," admitted Meek, "but there's no scandal, I hope." "The Chronicle can ill afford another libel. I imagine Miss Drabble would share that sentiment," Pubright said. Meek coloured faintly. "Oh, I'm sure she'll turn up. Girls like that always do. Bit flighty, perhaps. Pretty too." "Pretty too?" "Yes, sir," said Pubright. "Pretty enough to be inconvenient, I suspect." He thanked Mr. Meek and left, his thoughts quietly aligning themselves in the unhurried fashion that usually led somewhere fatal to somebody's reputation. Back at the station, Sergeant Malley was deciphering Mrs. Spink's latest update. "She says she's had a postcard, sir. Postmarked Scarborough. Sir, postmarked Scarborough. Says Iris is safe and not to worry." "Indeed. May I see it?" Malley handed it over with a grin of satisfaction. "Looks genuine." Pubright examined the card. It showed the Scarborough Promenade, bright with parasols and improbable sunlight. The handwriting was round and careful. "I'm well, please don't fuss. Tell everyone not to worry. Iris." The inspector turned it over once, then again. "The handwriting, Sergeant, is indeed round and careful. Perhaps a little too careful. To see how every letter leans precisely the same way. That is the habit of a clerk or a typist imitating feminine neatness." Malley frowned. "You mean someone else wrote it?" "I mean someone wanted Mrs. Spink to stop asking questions." He slipped the postcard into an envelope. "Find out who in this town owns a sheet of Scarborough Pier postcards. It may prove surprisingly local." That evening, Pubright took his usual solitary walk through the market square. The day's heat had faded into a soft dusk, and the lamplighter was making his rounds with gentle authority. Outside the photography shop, the display window showed the new Fayette prints, now labelled special commemorative copies, 2 shillings. The same gap smiled up at him like a missing tooth. As he watched, Miss Doreen Lanchester emerged from the shadows, glanced sharply at the window, then moved on. Her walk was brisk, her face composed, yet her eyes darted once toward the photograph, as if ensuring that absence remained exactly where she wanted it. Pubright lingered a moment longer, then turned away, murmuring to himself, "And nothing in Flaxborough disappears by accident, only by arrangement." And in that calm observation, the investigation truly began. The morning light in Flaxborough had a habit of arriving with faint embarrassment, as though apologizing for illuminating things best left dim. Mr. Jellicoe, standing in the doorway of his photography shop, looked as though he shared that sentiment entirely. His spectacles were misted, his collar uncertain, and his hands stained with the kind of guilt no soap could wash. He flinched visibly when Inspector Pubright appeared across the street, pausing to study the shop window as if merely admiring the composition. "Oh, Inspector," Jellicoe stammered when Pubright entered. "I was just tidying up. Very busy morning." Pubright glanced at the empty counter. Indeed, a moment's silence. Somewhere in the back, a clock ticked with the exaggerated importance of one doing the work of conscience. Pubright smiled. "Perhaps, Mr. Jellicoe, we might have a look at that negative again." "Oh, I'm afraid that won't be possible, Inspector." "Spoiled, you see. A chemical mishap. Happened yesterday." "How unfortunate," Pubright murmured, "and so soon after we last spoke. What sort of mishap?" "Developer contamination, I think, or perhaps mismeasurement." Yes, said Pubright mildly. "Common enough problem, though not, I imagine, with only 1 frame out of 12. Jellicoe swallowed. His mouth opened, closed, then opened again like a man rehearsing his own confession. "It wasn't me, Inspector, I swear it. I left the darkroom for a few minutes. When I came back, someone had interfered. I saw the film looked different somehow, like a smear. Purbright's voice remained gentle. Who had access? Only a few people. Miss Lanchester came in briefly. It said she wanted to collect her concert photographs. I told her I'd left them on the side counter. She was there maybe 3 minutes. 3 minutes can be very productive, Mr. Jellicoe, said Pubright softly. Did she handle the chemicals? I don't know. But when I returned, the negative of the fet was drying oddly. I noticed a faint patch, just where the young lady had been standing. And what did you do? Tried to save it. I really did. But the emulsion had lifted off. It was like she'd been rubbed away. When Pubright returned to the station, Sergeant Malley greeted him with the satisfied air of one who has accidentally achieved something. You were right, sir, about that postcard. Mr. Meek ordered a dozen of those Scarborough Pier cards last week from the stationer. Said they'd be useful for summer features. Useful indeed, murmured Pubright. I suppose he forgot to mention he also writes anonymous letters when civic spirit demands. Malley chuckled uncertainly. You think he wrote it? I think someone asked him to. Meek rarely invents trouble. He merely assists it. Pubright sat folding his hands. We shall leave Mr. Meek to his ink for now. Let's consider the Lanchesters. The brother delivers leaflets to Mrs. Spinks the night Iris vanishes. The sister appears in the darkroom where her image disappears. Both are models of civic probity. Malley frowned. You think they're involved? Pubright smiled faintly. When respectable people behave inconsistently, Sergeant, I find it prudent to assume guilt of some variety. The question is which were. That afternoon, Pubright called at the Lanchesters' home again, unannounced, which he found produced the most valuable reactions. Miss Doreen Lanchester opened the door herself. Her poise wavered just perceptibly. Inspector, how unexpected. Is there some new development? Only a small one, said Pubright pleasantly. A smudge, you might say, on a negative. Her lips tightened. I beg your pardon? A fair photograph, he said. It seems the image of Miss Drabble was erased chemically. Quite accidentally, I'm sure. Yet you were seen near the darkroom that day. That's absurd, she said crisply. I merely collected some photographs of the Music Society's recital. If Mr. Jellicoe suggests otherwise, he's mistaken. Mr. Jellicoe, said Pubright, suggests only that you were kind enough to tidy up in his absence. Doreen's eyes flickered, the faintest tremor of indignation crossing her composure. Inspector, if you imagine that I imagine very little, said Pubright. I observe. And I have observed that you and your brother have lately taken a remarkable interest in the Fete records. The purely administrative, she said. Of course. A long pause followed, just long enough for the ticking of the hall clock to become almost conversational. Miss Lanchester, Pubright continued gently. Did you know Iris Drabble? She hesitated. Just enough. Who? Not personally, fondly, socially, then. I've already told you. Yes, said Pubright, but not the same way each time. Her eyes narrowed. Are you accusing me of something? Pubright smiled with perfect courtesy. Not yet. But if you should think of anything you forgot to mention, do let me know. I'm very fond of accuracy, especially in photographs. He left before she could reply. Later that evening, Sergeant Malley entered the inspector's office carrying a small envelope. I found this in the post. Sir. Addressed to you. No return. Pubright opened it. Inside was a single strip of photographic film, a damaged negative, its emulsion partly lifted, showing a ghostly outline where a figure ought to be. At the bottom, written in smudged pencil, were 3 words, are not supposed to exist. Pubright turned it toward the lamplight, the faint outline of Iris Drabble's vanished figure just discernible, a pale silhouette against a world that had chosen to forget her. Sergeant, he said quietly, it appears our missing girl was inconvenient to more than one person. Malley swallowed. You think she's... Pubright looked at the ghostly film again. No, Sergeant. I think she's somewhere people like Miss Lanchester prefer not to look. He placed the film gently on the blotter, as though afraid to damage the last fragile trace of someone deliberately erased. And then, with that same calm tone that made his subordinates uneasy, he said, We shall proceed as if Miss Drabble was still alive. After all, it may prove awkward for certain individuals if she turns out not to be. It was generally understood in Flaxborough that if one wished to know what was really going on, one need only attend tea at the vicarage. Mrs. Gloss's teas were civic institutions, where conversation was poured as freely as the Darjeeling, and reputations dissolved more quickly than sugar. Inspector Pubright had accepted the invitation, as he often did when a case required less interrogation than eavesdropping. The drawing room was already occupied by several of the town's more articulate gossips: Miss Pokeley, hairdresser and part-time philosopher of morals, Mrs. Harbottle, retired librarian and unretired moralist, and Mrs. Spink, who had been promoted by recent events to the position of chief bereaved party. Mrs. Gloss presided over the gathering like a benevolent magistrate. "More tea, Inspector?" "You must have some of the trifle. It's from a new recipe, condensed milk instead of cream, more economical and less risky." "Irrisk," said Pubright mildly, "is a quality not often associated with trifle." There was polite laughter, except from Mrs. Spink, who sighed theatrically. "I can't help thinking of her, Inspector. That poor girl. Such a nice little thing. I even dream about her sometimes, standing there in that green frock." Mrs. Harbottle pursed her lips. "If you ask me, she wasn't quite the innocent you make her out to be, Mrs. Spink. A girl doesn't disappear from photographs for nothing." "Now really," said Mrs. Gloss, "we mustn't imply anything improper. The inspector is here, after all." Pubright smiled. "Please continue to imply. It saves me paperwork." A titter went around the table. Encouraged, Miss Pokeley leaned in. "Well, I heard from Mr. Meek that the Lanchesters have been dreadfully worried about the whole thing. Apparently the brother's been to see the photographer twice, asking whether any more negatives exist." Mrs. Harbottle nodded significantly. "Exactly." "If that doesn't suggest guilt, I don't know what does. You know what they say. It's always the respectable ones. And Lionel Lanchester has always been a pillar of this community," said Mrs. Gloss primly. "Though I must admit, Doreen can be rather abrupt." Mrs. Spink dabbed her eyes again. Miss Lanchester was never kind to Iris. "She came here once to collect rent money on behalf of the council," she said. Spoke to the girl so sharply, I almost said something. Purbright's spoon paused mid-stir. "A rent money?" "Yes, for that old housing loan Iris had. I think her mother took it out years ago, and Iris was paying it back. Miss Lanchester said she was helping." "Oh, very civic-minded," murmured Pubright. Mrs. Gloss tutted. "That does sound rather officious, though one must admit the Lanchesters do a great deal for the town. The brother especially." said Pubright softly. "A remarkable family tradition, the efficient removal of unpleasant traces." "I beg pardon?" said Mrs. Gloss. "I was thinking of the Fete photograph," said Pubright smoothly. "A small imperfection removed, no doubt, for aesthetic reasons." Mrs. Harbottle gave a pleased little gasp. "Then you think it was deliberate?" Pubright smiled politely. "I think nothing. I only listen." "Oh boy." After tea, Mrs. Gloss insisted on showing him to the door herself, a habit that served both as courtesy and reconnaissance. "I do hope this business is cleared up soon, Inspector. The town's nerves are quite frayed. Half the women won't go out after dark." "That should improve morale considerably," Pubright observed. Mrs. Gloss hesitated, torn between laughing and frowning. "You have such a, peculiar sense of humour, Inspector." "So I'm told," he said. "Usually by those who've just told me something they wish they hadn't." Her eyes widened faintly, and she busied herself with the latch. Outside, the late afternoon sun lit the square with that particular brightness which makes everything look faintly guilty. Pubright crossed to the Chronicle office. Mr. Meek looked up from his typewriter with the expression of a man caught mid-sin. "That's about the postcards I've already explained." "Are not postcards today, Mr. Meek?" said Pubright pleasantly. "I was wondering, those photographs of the fete, you made several prints, I believe." "Yes, indeed. 24 copies, sold most of them already." "To whom?" "Oh, the usual subscribers. Mrs. Gloss, Councillor Harby, the vicar, Miss Lanchester, of course." Pubright looked up. "Miss Lanchester purchased one?" "Yes, yesterday morning. Said she wanted it for records." Pubright nodded slowly. "For records? Yes, that sounds very like her." He turned to leave, then paused. "Mr. Meek, do you still have the list of purchasers?" Meek looked alarmed. "Is that necessary?" "Quite possibly not," said Pubright. "But then very few things are until one needs them." Back at the station, Pubright found Sergeant Malley puzzling over the developing tray that Jellicoe had surrendered earlier. "You can still see her outline, sir," said Mally, holding up the ruined film. "Like someone tried to rub her out with a cloth." "Or a conscience," murmured Pubright. He placed the list of photograph buyers beside the evidence and sat back. "Sergeant, do you recall the housing fund the council managed 3 years ago? The one for young working women?" "Yes, sir. Bit of a scandal over the accounts, if I remember." "Quite. The Lanchesters oversaw the committee. Some loans were irregular. Suppose our Miss Drabble was one of the recipients, and suppose she discovered how her payments were being used." Mally whistled softly. "A blackmail, a possibly, though I suspect the word embarrassment would suit them better. It's cleaner. It's cleaner." That night, Pubright sat by the window of his small flat above the station, pipe smoke curling like patient thought. The town below glimmered faintly under the street lamps, quiet, orderly, self-approving. Somewhere behind one of those neat curtains, he felt certain someone was regretting that Flaxborough's inspector was not as forgetful as the rest of the town. He tapped his pipe thoughtfully. "Us?" he murmured. "Is where the real confessions happen. One just has to listen between the teaspoons." Outside, the clock in the church tower struck 9, the hour at which in Flaxborough nothing much ever happened, which was precisely why Pubright never trusted it. It was a Wednesday morning when Mr. Meek failed to open the Flaxborough Chronicle. By noon, this was already known at the post office, the hairdressers, and the vicarage. By 2 o'clock, it had been discussed, condensed, and served as part of the afternoon gossip menu at Mrs. Gloss's tea. And by 3, Inspector Pubright had concluded that Mr. Meek had joined Miss Iris Drabble in what was fast becoming Flaxborough's most exclusive form of disappearance. The door to the Chronicle office was unlocked, but unoccupied. Inside, the smell of printing ink lingered, mixed with the faint metallic tang of recently boiled tea. The typewriter stood mid-sentence, a sheet still in its carriage. Local council meeting. Mayor praises efficiency of Fete committee. Purbright's eyes rested on the unfinished line. He doubted the mayor would have enjoyed reading the article in its completed form. He surveyed the office carefully. A chair slightly askew, a drawer left open, and on the desk, half concealed beneath an invoice, a small envelope addressed to Inspector Pubright, Flaxborough Police Station. He opened it carefully. Inside was a strip of photographic paper, another faint image of the Fete group, this time darker, badly developed, but with a faint new shadow visible beside the empty space where Iris Drabble had stood. A handprint, smudged, human. Pubright stared at it for a long moment. Then he folded the paper gently back into the envelope and said aloud to the room, "Oh, Mr. Meek, I do wish you'd left the typewriter running." By late afternoon, Sergeant Mally had traced the last person seen with Mr. Meek, none other than Miss Doreen Lanchester. She came by the Chronicle around 10, Mally reported. Said she wanted extra copies of the Fete photo for the Music Society display. Meek gave her 2, and she left. Then he went out to deliver proofs to the mayor's office and never came back. Did she mention where she was going afterwards? Home, apparently, though no one saw her till after lunch. Pubright leaned back in his chair. How very convenient. One disappearance immediately before another. It's beginning to look less like coincidence and more like choreography. That evening, Pubright called again at the Lanchester residence. This time, the door was opened not by Doreen, but by her brother, Lionel, pale, defensive, and smelling faintly of anxiety masked with cologne. "Inspector, I do hope this is not another intrusion into our private affairs." Private affairs," said Pubright mildly, "have a curious way of becoming public when accompanied by missing persons." Lionel stiffened. "If you're referring to that journalist, I know nothing about him. My sister merely collected her photographs, with nothing to hide." "Splendid," said Pubright. "Yes. Then you won't mind if I ask, where were you between 10 and 11 this morning? At the council offices. Ask anyone." "I intend to," said Pubright. "And your sister?" Lionel hesitated just slightly too long. "At home, of course." Purbright's gaze was polite, steady, and faintly amused. "Of course." He turned to leave, then paused. "Mr. Lanchester, one last question. Did you know Miss Iris Drabble personally?" "Certainly not." Lionel's voice rose an octave too high. "She was a trivial shop girl. I've no idea why you think." Pubright raised a hand. "I don't think anything, Councillor. Not yet. But I find the word trivial a useful clue. It so often conceals the opposite." Back at the station, Pubright spread the evidence across his desk. One vanished girl, one tampered photograph, one postcard forged to end inquiry, and now one missing newspaper editor who knew too much about both. Sergeant Malley hovered, frowning. "Oh, could the Lanchesters have done away with him, sir?" Pubright tapped the envelope thoughtfully. "Oh, I doubt they're the type for violence, Sergeant. But they do possess a remarkable instinct for preservation, particularly of themselves." Malley looked uneasy. "Then what do you think's happened to Meek?" "I think," said Pubright, "he found something, or someone. He wasn't meant to print." He stood and looked out of the window. The lamplighter was making his rounds again, striking up little points of orange through the gathering dusk. "And I think," Pubright added softly, "that Flaxborough is developing a taste for invisibility." The next morning brought rain, soft, polite rain, the sort that dampened scandal without washing it away. Mrs. Gloss called at the station with what she described as an entirely unimportant detail. "You shouldn't even mention it, Inspector, but I did see Mr. Meek yesterday morning near the riverside path. He was talking to a woman. I couldn't see who, but she wore a green mackintosh. I remember thinking, what an odd colour for this weather." "A green?" said Pubright. "You're certain?" "Oh, yes, rather bright. A spring shade." Purbright's expression didn't change, but his eyes sharpened slightly. "Thank you, Mrs. Gloss. You've been extremely helpful, which I suspect was not your intention." She blinked. "I beg your pardon, nothing at all. Do have a care walking home. The pavements can be treacherously revealing." He watched her go, then returned to his desk, the image of Iris Drabble's green frock flickering in his mind like a memory refusing to fade. By evening, the rain had stopped and a thin mist hung over the river. Pubright walked the towpath alone, his hands behind his back, the air filled with the quiet hum of midges and unanswered questions. Half a mile from the bridge he found what he'd expected, a battered bicycle half hidden in reeds. The small brass plate on its frame read, "F Chronicle, Delivery." Mr. Meek's bicycle. There was no sign of its owner, but something else caught the inspector's eye. A scrap of paper caught under the back wheel, soaked and curling, but still legible in parts. It was a Chronicle proof sheet. Headline, "Council Funds Query, Local Girls Connection?" And below it, in Meek's tidy typewriter font, "Miss Iris Drabble, formerly employed at Troley's Drapery, is believed to have had correspondence concerning irregularities in the Women's Housing Fund, supervised by Councillor Lionel Lanchester. The rest had blurred into illegibility." Pubright folded the paper gently, placed it in his pocket, and looked out over the dark, still water. "Yes," he murmured, "an easy conclusion is never quite tidy enough for Flaxborough." He turned back toward town, walking slowly, as though following the faint ghost of two figures, one in green and one with ink-stained fingers, vanishing into the fog together. Inspector Pubright had always found that the best way to think about people was in their absence. He sat in his office long after dark, the only light coming from a single green-shaded lamp and the faint glow from the street beyond the frosted window. The rest of the building was silent. Sergeant Malley had gone home, convinced that the inspector's capacity for quiet sitting was an early symptom of madness. Before Pubright lay the array of small facts, the sad fossils of a case, the Fayette photograph with its missing girl, the ruined negative, sent anonymously, the forged postcard. The Chronicle proof accusing the Lanchesters, and a bicycle, ownerless, rusting by the river. He regarded them not as clues but as manners, each an example of how people behaved when they wished something to be forgotten. The rain tapped faintly at the window. It sounded, he thought, like the town whispering against the glass. In Flaxborough, the most respectable crime was omission. No one here ever committed murder in the passionate sense. They merely arranged for something unpleasant to no longer exist. A dog that barked too much might be arammed. A troublesome tenant might be transferred. A pregnant girl might be sent away. The town ran on the delicate oil of euphemism. It was what kept it civilized, and what from time to time gave Pubright his work. He rose, went to the filing cabinet, and took down a thin folder marked Women's Housing Fund, 1962-64. He remembered it vaguely. A minor scandal quickly smothered, a few missing receipts, an accountant's clerical oversight, a polite apology read into the council minutes. Inside, the paperwork was immaculate, too immaculate. The signatures looped perfectly, the sums always balanced after revision. But there was one form, a loan granted to Miss Iris Drabble, 27 High Street Lodgings, that carried a faint pencil note in the margin, handled by Miss D. Lanchester. Temp, sir. Temp. Pubright tapped his pen against it thoughtfully. Handled, he murmured. A useful word, covers both assistance and disposal. At 11 o'clock he left the station and walked through the sleeping town. The drizzle had turned to mist, and the lamplight seemed suspended in little bowls of moisture. He passed the churchyard, the faintly glowing windows of Mrs. Gloss's house, and the dark silhouette of the Chronicle office. Flaxborough looked as peaceful as a corpse in repose. In such towns, Pubright thought, guilt was rarely a secret, only a habit. People didn't conceal it from others so much as from themselves. They believed in order, in decency, in the comfort of appearances. And when a thing threatened to disarrange that, whether a girl, a rumour, or a photograph, they tidied it away with astonishing efficiency. He lit his pipe, its smoke curling like thought. The trick, he said softly to himself, is that everyone believes someone else is responsible. The landlady blames the girl's morals, the counsellor blames her ambitions, the vicar's wife blames her mother, and before long she's vanished without anyone ever having done the vanishing. He smiled faintly at the bleak perfection of it. Crossing the square, he paused before the town hall window where the Fête photograph was now displayed, the official print, framed and captioned. Flaxborough's Summer Fête, 1965, a day to remember. Indeed it was. He studied the composition for the 100th time, the arch of flowers, the mayor's satisfied grin, the bandleader squinting against the sun, and there, precisely between the mayoress and Mrs. Gloss, the faint space of air that should have been a girl in a green frock. It wasn't merely absence, it was an act of precision. Someone had planned for her not to be there, not only in the photograph but in memory. Yet memory, like film, sometimes keeps traces of what was meant to be erased. He recalled Mrs. Gloss's description of the woman in the green mackintosh by the river, and the handprint on the photograph paper, a hand that had touched both image and truth. He looked up at the rain-misted street lamps. You tried to disappear her, he said quietly, and now she's disappearing you. He was not certain to whom he was speaking. The town itself, perhaps. Back in his office, he made a few neat notes in his ledger under the heading Working Hypothesis. Iris Drabble discovered misuse of housing fund. Confronted Miss Lanchester or brother Lionel, was silenced socially, sent away, paid off, or worse. Photograph altered to erase her presence from Fête records. Mr. Meek uncovered connection, attempted to print story. Result, another disappearance. He tapped the pen thoughtfully. The Lanchesters won't have killed them, he said aloud, but they will know who did. At midnight, Pubright leaned back, extinguished the lamp, and let the darkness settle around him. The sound of rain softened to a faint hiss. He thought about Iris Drabble again, not as a missing person, but as an idea. The idea of what small towns prefer not to acknowledge. Youth, poverty, beauty without protection, scandal without pedigree. Flaxborough, he realized, was less a place where people vanished than a place where people were rubbed out, edited until they fitted. He smiled faintly, his expression one of melancholy amusement. Perhaps he murmured, "Prill a little retouched." And with that he rose, put on his hat, and stepped out into the rain, walking toward the Lanchesters' villa with the patient stride of a man about to ask a very polite and very inconvenient question. Flaxborough had endured a week of unease, the kind that doesn't quite rise to panic but settles comfortably into the upholstery of conversation. The Fête photograph still hung in the town hall, the Chronicle office still stood dark, and Miss Lanchester had taken to attending church twice a day, which in Flaxborough was the surest sign of guilt without confession. It was therefore considered a gesture of civic healing when Inspector Pubright invited the principal Fête committee members to a smaller thank-you gathering at the police station's meeting room. The announcement caused confusion. "The police holding a party?" said Mrs. Gloss. "How original." "What for?" asked Mrs. Harbottle. "They've not found anyone." "Exactly," replied Mrs. Gloss. "Perhaps they're celebrating the efficiency." At 7 o'clock on Thursday evening, the guests assembled. 12 in all, including the mayor, Councillor Harby, Mrs. Gloss, Miss Pokeley, Mrs. Spink, Lionel and Doreen Lanchester, and a few other worthies. The police station's meeting room had been transformed in a modest way. a table of sandwiches, a jug of lemonade, and a large framed photograph on the wall. The photograph, Pubright greeted each arrival with his usual gentleness. His civility, as always, carried the faint chill of a doctor's scalpel. "So good of you to come. A little informal, I'm afraid, but one must thank public spirit when one sees it." When everyone had been served tea, Pubright took his place by the photograph. He began speaking as if giving a minor civic address. "I imagine," he said pleasantly, "that most of you recognize this fine piece of work by Mr. Jellicoe. It captures Flaxborough at best, cheerful, respectable, well-arranged." A murmur of agreement. The mayor nodded sagely. "And yet," Pubright continued, "every perfection has its flaw. In this case, a small omission, one less face than there ought to be." The silence that followed was gentle but definite. Mrs. Gloss shifted in her chair. "Oh, surely, Inspector, we've all quite accepted that poor girl must have gone away." Yes," Pubright interrupted softly, and I find the speed of that acceptance rather striking." A faint rustle of discomfort travelled through the room. Purbright's tone remained conversational. In most towns, the unexplained absence of a young woman might provoke alarm. Here it seems to have provoked only editing. Doreen Lanchester set down her cup with a click. "If you mean to accuse the Fayette Committee of tampering with the photograph, Inspector, I think that's highly irregular." "A tampering?" said Pubright mildly. "What an interesting choice of word." I had not used it myself. She flushed slightly. Lionel glanced at her, then at Pubright, with the look of a man trying to calculate how much silence costs. "You have no right," Doreen began. "None whatever," Pubright agreed pleasantly. "I rely entirely on your sense of civic duty." He turned to the photograph. "Mr. Jellicoe tells me that during development someone adjusted the chemicals. A small act of retouching. Easily done, quite deliberate. The girl who vanished, Miss Drabble, was standing precisely here." He tapped the empty space with one finger. "Curious, isn't it, that her disappearance coincided with the audit of the Women's Housing Fund?" Lionel Lanchester rose halfway from his chair. "This is outrageous." "Indeed," said Pubright calmly, "as is falsifying loan documents, though I dare say it seemed harmless enough at the time." Mrs. Gloss gasped. Mrs. Spink muttered, "I always said that fund was queer." Pubright looked directly at Lionel. "You authorized payments in Iris Drabble's name after she had ceased receiving them, did you not? Rather clever, using her installments to balance accounts elsewhere." But the girl realized she threatened to make it public, and then quite suddenly she ceased to exist. Doreen stood, her voice brittle. "You can't prove that." "No," said Pubright softly. "I needn't. The proof was removed, as efficiently as the girl herself. But the attempt to erase her image betrayed the one person who knew the process." He nodded toward the photograph again. "The smudge left a trace, a handprint, Miss Lanchester, yours on the developer tray, the same day you collected your Music Society pictures." The room was utterly still. Pubright continued, in a tone of mild regret. "I don't think you meant harm. I think you simply panicked. You tried to make the problem smaller, as small as a missing face. But small towns, Miss Lanchester, have long memories, and occasionally an inspector with an inconvenient sense of curiosity." Doreen sank slowly into her chair. Her brother stared fixedly at the tablecloth. Pubright smiled faintly. Forgiveness, the most British of verdicts. 10 minutes later, the party broke up with the quiet confusion of people leaving a funeral. The mayor muttered about a regrettable misunderstandings. Mrs. Gloss whispered that she'd always suspected something, which was, of course, not true. Pubright remained behind, pouring himself the last of the lukewarm tea. Sergeant Malley entered, eyebrows raised. "Well, sir, a Miss Lanchester will come round tomorrow morning," said Pubright. "She'll bring a written statement. Not a confession, of course. That would be vulgar. Merely a clarification. And the brother, Veal, resigned from the council before the week's out. For health reasons. They all do." Malley nodded slowly. "Do you think we'll find the girl, sir?" Pubright looked up at the photograph one last time, at the small, immaculate space where someone had once stood smiling. "Perhaps, Sergeant," he said, "but not in any form that satisfies the law. Some people vanish so completely that even finding them doesn't bring them back." He turned off the light. "Still," he added, "it's a comfort to know that Flaxborough for once will have something genuine to talk about." The council chamber of Flaxborough was at its most honest when empty. It was never truly clean, only rearranged, like conscience after confession. But this morning it was full again. Councillors in their Sunday suits, the mayor glistening faintly, and Miss Doreen Lanchester sitting very upright beside her brother, pale as starch. Inspector Pubright stood at the far end of the long oak table. His notes were few, his tone as ever courteous. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "I appreciate your time. What I have to say concerns not scandal but clarity, and I'm afraid the difference between propriety and decency." A rustle, a cough. The mayor nodded solemnly, not yet knowing whether to approve or object. Pubright continued, "You will recall that during the summer fete a photograph was taken. Later, when developed, one figure was missing, Miss Iris Drabble. She was a lodger at number 7, St. Olave's Lane, and an employee at Trowley's Drapery. She also, as it happens, was a beneficiary of the council's Women's Housing Fund." He paused. The words councils and fund always cause subtle discomfort when used together. A Miss Drabble discovered certain irregularities in her loan repayments. Specifically, that the payments were being redirected to a separate account managed by Councillor Lionel Lanchester. When she approached him about it, she was assured that a clerical error would be corrected. It was not. Lionel Lanchester's face reddened. "That's absurd. You can't—" Pubright raised a mild hand. "I can, Councillor." Mr. Meek of the Chronicle confirmed receiving documentation from Miss Drabble, copies of receipts and correspondence. He was preparing an article when he disappeared. There was a collective intake of breath. "Mr. Meek," Pubright went on, "I met with Miss Drabble near the river the morning after the fete. She intended to leave town and asked that the story be published if she did not return. Unfortunately, Miss Doreen Lanchester followed her there, intending to retrieve those documents." All eyes turned to Doreen. Her lips moved faintly, as though reciting an internal prayer. Purbright's tone remained calm. Miss Drabble, frightened by the confrontation, slipped, or was pushed, into the river. It matters little now which. The current took her before either woman fully grasped what had happened. And then Miss Lanchester acted not out of cruelty but instinct, the Flaxborough instinct for tidiness. A few councillors shifted uneasily, as if the inspector had just accused them collectively. She went that afternoon to Mr. Jellicoe's studio, where the fete photograph was being developed, and removed the girl's image. Quite literally, a smudge of chemical solvent was all it took. The rest of the town, meanwhile, did what towns do best. They believed the first story that required no thinking. The room was utterly silent. Even the mayor's habitual breathing seemed suspended. Pubright turned a page of his notes. Later, when Mr. Meek began asking questions, Miss Lanchester's brother persuaded him to keep quiet. "That's a good name of the council," I believe were the words. But Meek, being an optimist, prepared to publish regardless, he never reached his printing press. He disappeared along the same path where Miss Drabble did. His bicycle was found. He was not. He let that hang for a moment. I think Mr. Meek tried to retrieve what he'd hidden near the river, the receipts, perhaps a note. He failed. But he left behind something else. Pubright produced a small envelope and withdrew the damaged photograph paper, the one with the faint handprint. "You see, the thing about negatives is that they record everything, even the hands that try to destroy them. A fingerprint, Miss Lanchester. Yours, preserved in the developer fluid. The print was tested this morning." A faint murmur rippled through the room. Doreen made no sound. Only her eyes, fixed on the paper, betrayed the slow recognition of inevitability. "Inspector," said the mayor faintly, "must this be made public?" Pubright smiled with polite sadness. "That depends, your worship, on whether you prefer decency or reputation." He gathered his papers slowly. "I am recommending no prosecution. The evidence for deliberate homicide is insufficient. But I shall file a report. And a name. Lionel Lanchester Halfrose. This is monstrous. We have served this town for—" "Indeed you have," said Pubright. "And Flaxborough, I am sure, will repay you with its usual generosity." Silence. He turned toward the door. "Good day, ladies and gentlemen. I suggest the fete photograph be removed from display. It represents something the town may wish to forget, though for once perhaps it should remember." Outside, the air was bright and cold. The river glinted under a thin sun, looking as innocent as ever. Pubright paused at the bridge, gazing at the slow water. Sergeant Malley joined him, cab in hand. Will there be charges, sir? Pubright shook his head. Oh no, there will be consequences, which is much rarer, and the bodies. Well, perhaps someday the river will give them back, or perhaps it already has in spirit. Mally frowned. You mean? Pubright smiled faintly. The town's conscience, Sergeant. It has a way of floating to the surface. He turned to walk back toward the station, his footsteps unhurried, his coat collar up against the wind. He understands that some matters are best left domestic. They all nodded in approval. Later that afternoon, Pubright called at the vicarage. The Reverend Gloss, who spent most of his ministry feeling faintly apologetic, received him in the study. Inspector, he said, I confess I find it difficult to preach on moral clarity these days. Pubright smiled. Then you're already halfway to salvation. The vicar sighed. You don't believe in simple goodness, do you? I believe in small decencies, said Pubright. They're more achievable. He looked out of the window toward the square. In Flaxborough, wickedness rarely raises its voice. It just tidies the room. The vicar frowned. And you? What do you do? Pubright smiled, lighting his pipe. I noticed the dust. As the weeks passed, the town regained its tranquil rhythm. The band rehearsed for autumn concerts. Mrs. Spink found a new lodger, a nice typist from the gas board, and the council minutes made no reference to the housing fund ever again. And yet, in small ways, something had changed. Children no longer played by the river after dark. The Fed Committee, once bustling with volunteers, struggled to fill its roster. Even Mrs. Gloss's teas grew a little quieter, as if the town had learned that too much talking could sometimes lead to visibility. Flaxborough had adjusted itself, as it always did, but the adjustment had left a faint misalignment, a small unease. On an overcast Thursday, Pubright sat once more at his desk, completing his final entry in the case ledger. A matter concluded. Local stability restored. No further incidents anticipated. He capped his pen, folded the file closed and placed it neatly in the cabinet. For a moment he sat very still, gazing at the single photograph he had kept, the fair picture in its unedited form. He thought of Iris Drabble, of Mr. Meek, of all the small erased souls who had drifted through the town's polite machinery. Then he smiled faintly and murmured to himself, Well, Miss Drabble, you've been developed at last. He turned out the lamp, the room falling into soft shadow, and reached for his coat. Outside, the evening bells of St. Olaise were chiming, slow, deliberate, perfectly timed. Flaxborough, tidy once more, exhaled its secret into the mist. And Inspector Pubright, walking home beneath the lamps, looked like a man entirely at peace with untidiness.